If you're not aware, if you're sitting on these rows, you get all the questions. They're not aware of that yet, are they? Okay. We'll get to that later. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're going to pick up our study of our Old Testament overview. And today we'll be focusing on Exodus through Deuteronomy. Jordan got us started the last two sessions going through a two-part series on Genesis, getting going there. And if you recall, the theme of our study is going to be the Old Testament is our tutor, bringing us to Christ. So we're going to be emphasizing those points of what we find in the Old Testament that makes us aware of the coming Messiah and the fulfillment of prophecies that we see in his life. So, quick overview of what we'll do today. We'll go back and just get reset on where we were with Genesis very quickly. Take a quick, probably 10, 15-minute overview of the four books that we'll cover today, Exodus through Deuteronomy. Then we want to focus most of our time on the character studies of the main characters that we see in those four books, which would be Moses, the people of Israel themselves, and the Lord, and their role in those four books and what we learn from them and examples we have from them. We'll talk a bit about evidences, which I think is quite important for us to look backwards through what we find in archaeology and history that validate what we read about in the Bible. And then we'll close out with a few closing comments about how these four books lead us to Jesus in particular. So, as we look back to the review of Genesis, which means origins, very appropriate that the book means the beginning of things. We talked about, Jordan had two sections. One, the first 11 verses are chapters, and we had four key events there. Remember the four events? Creation, flood. You had the fall of man in there somewhere, and the dispersion. Okay, so those are the four key ones. And we talked about what we read about in those 11 chapters that led us to Jesus. And so a couple of things. We read the plurality of the terms used to refer to God. In Genesis 1, let us. And so we know that there's more than one character there when we talk about the Lord God. And we see that carried forward in the personage of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And then in Genesis 3, the promise that the Lord made to Adam and Eve that the seed of Satan would have his head bruised, but the seed of woman would have his heel bruised, referring directly to Jesus. The last, I can't do math this early in the morning. Chapters 12 through 50, four key people that we talked about there. Who were the four key people that we talked about? Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph and his sons. Okay. Those are the four key people we talked about. And then leading us to Jesus, there were several things we talked about. The promise to Abraham, in his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed. We didn't touch on this specifically, but you can think about the sacrifice of Isaac and the analogies that we draw between his sacrifice, what Abraham was required to do, and what the Father did on our behalf, sacrificing his son for us. And finally, in Genesis 49, Judah is told as he is blessed by Jacob, the scepter and lawgiver shall not depart until Shiloh comes, which means the kingship and the law would be given through the tribe of Judah, which is exactly what happened via Jesus. So that's background real quick, what we covered. We're still in this first section, Genesis through Deuteronomy, obviously creation through the books of the law, so we're not out of that yet. And in terms of time frame, we've been through creation through getting Jacob and the Israelites to Egypt. So that's about the first 2,200, 2,500 years of Bible chronology. So that's behind us. This week, we're going to jump ahead about 500 years to the time where the children of Israel leave the country of Egypt and make it through the new land of Canaan. So that's about 500 years throughout that duration, just to set the time frame for us. From a geography point of view, where are we? So we're going to be up in the northeast part of Africa, northwest part of the Middle East, where that little red box is. And then specifically, we'll see in this map the journey that they took through these four books. So we start on the upper left in Egypt, travel down through the Sinai Peninsula to Mount Sinai, down at the very center bottom, and then back up and around for about 40 years through the wanderings, and we end up on the upper right-hand side on the east side of Canaan at the end of this story. How does that map to the books? Well, just like this. Exodus gets us from Egypt down to Mount Sinai. Leviticus is written there at Mount Sinai and covers that time period. Numbers covers the longest time period of these 4 books, about 40 years, through their wanderings, getting from Mount Sinai through the wilderness and up to Canaan. Deuteronomy takes place right on the eastern shore of the Jordan as they're about to enter the land of Canaan. All makes sense so far? Got kind of baseline? Okay. We've got 4 books, 137 chapters. We need some speed readers this morning. Do we have any volunteers? The front rows always volunteer. Are y'all ready to go? Oh. Actually, we're not going to be able to read all that. It's a lot of material. Jordan did a good job, though, last time, I think. So we're going to summarize each of the books just to get the overview of what's in each book and come at it from the book point of view, and then come at it the other way from the major personalities. So kind of view it from 2 different directions to kind of get an overall view of what's in these books. So Exodus means going out, which is very appropriate. Mostly focuses on the children of Israel getting out of Egypt and down to Sinai. Starts in the Jewish year 1, month 1, day 15 is really when the chronology starts for the children of Israel. So just very quick, top of mind, what do you remember about the book of Exodus? What's top of mind for you when you think about what happens in that book? Passover's a good one, yes. Plagues on Egypt, absolutely. The Red Sea parts, yep. Giving of the law starts there, doesn't it? Yes, absolutely. Any others? I'm sorry? Whining starts, doesn't it? Yes. And another continual theme through these books is the whining part of it. A big one, parting of the Red Sea, yes. Sorry? Yeah, that's going to start right after this one, yes. This sets it up, the whining starts it, and some of the bad habits that take place there. So a few things, we can summarize this. So again, we're going to think of Exodus as Egypt to Sinai and all these things that happen. So we read about Moses and where he comes from and his commissioning, if you will, from God to lead the people. All of that happens in the book of Exodus. The leadership of them getting out of Egypt, what takes place around that with the 10 plagues, the destruction and judgment of Egypt and their army. All of that takes place in Exodus. The law and the covenant are given. Remember, he's on the mountain for 40 days, 40 nights. Now, the part in red, I want us to just file away because we need to refer back to this over and over and over as we get through the Old Testament. So Moses comes down with the law. What is the commitment that the children of Israel give to Moses and to the Lord that day? In red. All the words which the Lord has said, we will do. That was their commitment. And we're going to see how quickly that all starts falling apart. And we're going to come back to that verse over and over again because they made the commitment, and then we're going to see their challenges in keeping up with it. And then the issue of idolatry begins. So in addition with the whining that Mike mentioned, we have idolatry starts right away as they're coming out of Egypt. This is the golden calf, of course. So that's kind of some of the highlights that we see in Exodus. But again, think of it, Egypt to Sinai, all of these things start, and we're really introduced heavily to Moses and his role in leading the children of Israel. So Leviticus, next book, means, of all things, related to the Levites. No big surprise here. A lot of detail in Leviticus, as I think we look back at that verse and read through everything that happens in the setup of the Levitical law and the priesthood and what happens with temple worship. All takes place there in the book of Leviticus. It does occur down at Mount Sinai, so it's a relatively short time frame. So if you think of it about up to a year to get down to Sinai, and then about a year at Sinai, and then they're going to take off from there. So about a year across that whole time. So what are the things you remember from Leviticus? Anything stand out? Just thinking back of things we learned in Leviticus. Sacrifices start, yes. The laws about that. Yes, the temple is very well defined in this book, absolutely. Any examples we learn from in Leviticus? Starts with Nadab, ends with Abihu, anything like that? Really terrible examples of departing from God's commands right away and what happens to them. So some things that we read there are Aaron and his sons are set up as the Levitical priesthood. The ministry begins. All the details start with the temple, not the temple, but the tabernacle and how to worship. And then right away, we have a case of disobedience by Nadab and Abihu, which led to a severe punishment. God kills them both and makes a very strong point there that you will abide with my law and you won't go outside of my law. Steve?
And he says, be holy because I, the Lord, am holy.
Right.
The theme, I think.
Right.
To the children of God,
Exactly. So we're going to read a couple of things later on in our discussion today, things that lead us to our understanding of God's desire for how we obey him. And when we talk about Bible authority and things that we do today as worship as Christians and service as Christians, we read about these things also in the Old Testament. Here is one. What did we learn from Nadab and Abihu? What did they do? What was their sin? Brian?
I was moving on to
Leviticus includes the sacrificial system, of which a big one, of course, is the Day of Atonement, which covers the sins under the first covenant.
Right. So their sin was, Dan? Strange fire. They went beyond, right? So they offered something God had not commanded. And that's one of the principles we have today. We can't go beyond what God has asked us to do. Go ahead, Albert.
Exodus and Pharaoh hardened heart, and then with Nadab and Abihu, they chose to go against the law. So same challenge for us today. Our hearts, not physically condition of our heart, but do we harden our heart with choice, and do we have choices before us? Do we choose to go against God?
Exactly. Okay, any other comments there? We'll move on into Numbers. So from a time span point of view, this is the longest time frame that's covered in these 4 verses, our 4 books. And this is where the numbering or the census of the people happens. And recall, as they depart Sinai and they're going to head back up on that map to the upper right, the children refuse to go into the land. And this is why they end up wandering around for the 40 years. So this is the documentation of what happens in those 40 years. So we go from Sinai to the edge of Canaan, and in a time frame point of view, you see there they're leaving Jewish year 2, month 2, day 20. So we're about a year and a month into their life cycle, if you will, after leaving Egypt. The first census, as they left Sinai, was about 625,000 men above 20. That's covering all the tribes. 40 years later, they're about to go into Canaan. What's their population? 625 plus or minus. So very similar. But what happened to that 625,000 that were counted at Sinai before they got to Canaan? They all died. So this is a fresh crop. Okay, it's amazing that it's about the same number, but that population was basically replaced during the 40 years by the time they got to Canaan. A lot happens in this book, and there's a lot of lessons for us, and like we've said over and over, you could spend multiple lesson sessions on each one of these because there's so much rich content here. But some of the things that come to mind from your prior studies of Numbers. Anything? The census? Okay. That was a gimme. That's all right. I'll give you a few. One of the biggest ones was this is where the people refused to go into the land. So they don't believe that God is able to get them into the land because there were giants and they were worried about overcoming everything. And it was only Joshua and Caleb that said, yes, we can do it. Let's go now. And the people rebel and say no. So they are punished to wander 40 years in the wilderness. And all those over age 20 are going to end up dying. So there are also multiple uprisings against Moses during this time frame. And Daniel almost taught the bulk of this lesson today when we are going to talk about Moses and his characters. A lot that we read about Moses, we learn from this book about how much he cared for the people, how humble and meek he was, and how he served God. But these uprisings take place, and in each case, God steps in to set the record straight, and Moses ends up continuing to lead the people. Back to what Mike said before, the complaining, the whining continues. We see it over and over again. Also, the people are going to repeatedly commit idolatry and also getting into harlotry with the nations around about them. This is where Moses also sins. Recall that he's had this long, arduous journey so far, but in the midst of this, he is going to disobey God in a way that we'll see in just a minute did not bring glory and honor to God, while Moses struck a rock instead of speaking to it as he was commanded to do. So this is where that happens. And the children of Israel are initially tested here in Numbers militarily to prepare them for what's going to face them as they go into Canaan. So you see all those nations that they end up having to fight in the book of Numbers: Canaanites, Amorites, and King Og, the king of Bashan. So all of that's taking place in Numbers. Lots of information there. And finally, Deuteronomy, and remember our timeline, this is taking place as they're about to enter the land of Canaan. So they're east of the Jordan, getting ready to cross over. Deuteronomy literally means the second law. So we've had the law given through Exodus and through parts of Leviticus, and now we're going to have a recounting of that by Moses before they go into the country of, or the land of Canaan. So again, we're on that east edge of Canaan. What stands out to you about Deuteronomy? Anything that happens there? Death of Moses, absolutely. That's a good one. The death of Moses, you said? Yeah, takes place here. Joshua is appointed the next leader, right? Because Moses is going to die. Say again? Yes, Moses' farewell speeches. Exactly. So a couple of other things that we'll just kind of summarize here. So Moses does give the recount of here's everything God has done for you since the time we left Egypt, coming through the wilderness to now. So that's a quick summary of everything that's happened. He also gives a recount of the law and God's covenant with the children of Israel. A reminder, before you go into the land, this is what God has told us to do. What are the key exhortations he has there? Look, you've got to totally destroy the Canaanites. That's the command. So when you go into the land, we have to get rid of all of them. Obey, obey, obey. Do not forget. Teach your children. And this is one of the things that hurts so badly as we get through the rest of the study and we get into the Joshua and Judges. How long did it take the children of Israel to fall away and forget the Lord? Anyone recall? How many generations did it take? Did you say, Albert? It was one generation it took for the children of Israel to forget the Lord. So here he is saying, don't forget, train your children, teach your children. So obviously they didn't do that. And to wrap that up, blessings if you obey and curses if you're disobedient to what the Lord has to say. So all of that was kind of summarized in the book of Deuteronomy as they're about to enter to Canaan. He also talks about the coming prophet. We'll read about this specifically coming up. And when we talk about things that tie the Old Testament to Jesus, this is one of those verses that is directly aligned with what Moses says back there, plus or minus 1500 BC, to Christ coming on the scene about 1500 years later. As we said, Joshua is elected, or selected as the new leader, and Moses dies. So those are the four chapters to cover today, kind of quick outline of what they're there, but you just keep in mind that Exodus gets us from Egypt to Sinai and all the miracles that come along with that. Leviticus gives the priesthood, gives the new law, gives the tabernacle, all the details around that. Numbers is 40 years of wandering and the rebellion up and down there. And then Deuteronomy is right before we go into Canaan. Here's the law again, here's the commands again, and here's why we need to be obeying God. So any other summary thoughts, comments about that? Very quiet, especially the front row. I'm disappointed in the front row today.
The promised land. He got to see it, but he didn't go.
Right. Moses was left out because of his sin specifically, right? Steve?
God really does love his people, and he wants his people to love him. For me, that's Deuteronomy.
That's a good summary, Steve, and we're going to see that in some verses coming up in just a minute about the character of God that we learn about here is just amazing about how much he cared for his people. how tolerant he really was. Brian?
The other thing I think of
About- Well, the other point that I thought of as you were going through the review is that when the Israelites refused to enter into the land, it's a messianic viewpoint of Christ giving us the victory, because it was God that told the Israelites that he was giving them the land. It was promised to them. It was fulfilled. That's why it's called the promised land. But if you notice that after the Israelites were refused entrance because of their sins, they decided they're going to go in without God, and they were defeated. So you can see that it was God that gave them the victories as Joshua led them into battle.
Right.
Same as Christ gives us the victory as we're in battle against Satan in this present time.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay, we're going to shift focus from the book view of those 4 books to the character that we read about in the book. And so the first one we want to focus on is Moses. So a lot written about Moses, obviously, 137 chapters, and he is a point of continuity through that whole series of books and chapters. So what do we remember about Moses? As we think about him, and particularly in mind of what we said the themes of the study were, examples that we can learn from, and also pointing us to Jesus. What do we remember about Moses?
He's a prophetic figure of Christ, and we can see where he served as the mediator and intercessor as he interceded on behalf of God, had God change his mind as God was slaying them in the wilderness.
Right. Very good. If we could replay Daniel's lesson, or part of it, we could hit a bunch of these points, because he touched on a bunch of them. Robert? He saw God face to face. Yes. Albert? Strove to do good for others. Yes. And Brian?
he was timid. He did not want to free his people. He wasn't worthy. God says he will do it.
Right. And he says, I can't speak, and what does he do? Here's your brother Aaron. He'll be your mouthpiece. Absolutely. He was shying away from leadership. Anything else come to mind? Yes. Egyptian? Right. Arrogance of Moses at the end, yes. Which led to his sin, right? Yes. A lot we can read or learn about Moses for sure. Robert? Strong partner with Joshua. A helper? Yes. Because Joshua was with him going up the mountains, right? And also appointed to be the next leader. Yes, Steve? A great writer? Yes. Yes. Prolific, right? Yes. Yeah. Brian?
When God told Moses he would not be able to reflect upon Moses pleaded with him, please let me enter. God rebuked him.
Yes. So even though he wanted to, God said no. And here's why. So absolutely a lesson on sin, and things we can learn from today, right? Okay, so things I had written down before. So first of all, we know that he was brought up in Egyptian royalty, which is interesting in and of itself. So as Brian said, he was found in the basket in the river and ends up being in as part of the household of Pharaoh's daughter. So we know he has a royal upbringing, but after that, and he kills the Egyptian and has to leave the land, he becomes what? A shepherd. And it's interesting that we have throughout the Bible this shepherd theme and how important it is to us. Who else was known to be a shepherd? Christ was. David was. And what's the importance of having the background of being a shepherd relative to leading people? I like that. Good summary. Protect, guard, feed the flock. And sometimes, do sheep know the right thing to do? Not always. They tend to wander off. We read about the one that Jesus talks about, the 99 versus the one that wanders off. Okay, so sometimes you have to go correct an erring sheep. There's lots of analogies that we could take to being a shepherd to what is required from Moses at this particular time to lead a large, in some cases unruly, in many cases complaining, and in other cases, disobedient people to get them from Egypt all the way to Canaan. What a job. And if anyone saw that job description on Glassdoor or some of those recruiting sites, I'm not sure any of us would be pushing the button, sign me up for that job. It just doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. So yeah, he's got a lot on his hands here. So the shepherd part of it really was helping him in what he would have to do with leading this people. And of course, as we said before, he turns into a prophet, obviously, and a leader for the people in multiple fronts. What else? Brian, you said this before. Initially, he tried to avoid this job. And God says, you're the guy, okay? And I'm going to help you do this, and here's Aaron, your mouthpiece, basically, to be your spokesman. So regardless of how Moses tried to get out of this, he was going to be the leader. We talked about this before, and this is one of the direct quotes that Daniel had this morning. His humility, meekness. And when we think of humility today, what do we think of? Weak, timid, mild-mannered maybe? But when we look at the biblical term meekness and humility, what do we find? It's willingness to subject yourselves to a higher power. And so a horse, when it's tamed, is willing to take the bridle and the reins as being meek. Even though he has the power and strength to do whatever he wants to, he's exhibiting meekness in the sense that he is now submitted to another person. That's the same kind of concept we have here. Who was Moses willing to submit to? God. So now he's going to be the leader, and he's going to have this responsibility both as prophet and leader, and he says he's going to get it done. So the man Moses was very humble, or meek, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. That's quite a testimony for him. This one really stands out to me is how much he actually stood, I'm going to try and pick my words correctly here, between God and the people. And what I mean by that is God on multiple occasions was ready to just start over. I'm done. Everyone's gone. Moses, we're starting back with you. Reset. And Moses on multiple occasions steps into the breach and says, take me, don't take them. Or I pray on behalf of them. Or Lord, please don't do this. He stands between the people and their punishment that God was ready to administer to them, and is willing to sacrifice himself in a couple of cases so that the people don't. So look at those verses there. He pleaded with the Lord, blot me out, take me instead of them. That's what he was willing to do. With Miriam, when Aaron and Miriam got out of line, he says, no, please heal her, O God. I'm praying for her, even though she tried to overthrow me. Pardon the iniquity of this people. Shall one man sin and you be angry with all the congregation? And this incident with Korah happened. And again, Numbers 21, Moses prayed for the people. So he was their intercessor, and he was actually willing to be the sacrifice on behalf of them just so that they wouldn't be destroyed. Amazing number of times that Moses did this on behalf of the people. Any others come to mind there, Brian? Right.
So you can see the role of that Christ makes on our behalf.
Exactly. So the summary comments here basically are Deuteronomy 34, verse 10. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, as we've said, and all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and at all his land, and by all that mighty power, and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So nice summary comments about what Moses was all about, and the likeness to what he did for Israel and what Jesus has done for us is just an unbelievable parallel for us to learn from. Any other questions, comments about Moses?
It's amazing how willing Moses is to go to bat for the people, considering how constantly frustrated he is with their actions and their attitudes. And that's, to me, that's a parallel with Jesus. How frustrated is he with us on our constant lack of faith and our lack of behavior, but yet he still goes to bat for us every time.
Right. Very good point. Strong analogies. And we're going to read in a minute the prophecy by Moses of the future prophet. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But that's direct line of sight that Moses offers, that there will be one after me. And that's the one you're going to listen to when he gets here. Right now, here's the will of the Lord and what we need to be doing. Steve, did you have a comment?
Not like he never got angry.
Right.
I mean, number 16, he basically was, the scripture says he was very angry, and he didn't want God Almighty to take so much as a donkey from them. And so I guess impulsive he is at times, certainly meek, I won't argue that, or humble. But, I think of it in terms of our leadership. And I think of it in terms of my father and when he was an elder in the church, and my grandfather and my great-grandfather. And I think about how kind and tender-hearted and meek they were. But what they had to put up with, after a while, just grated on them so much that they became very angry. I think there's a lesson in that for all of us, and I see that in Moses. He handled himself really, for the most part, very well.
Right. So can you be meek and angry at the same time? Yes. Was Jesus meek and angry at the same time? Yes, he was. And so those two aren't contradictory. It does happen. By the way, they didn't have Xerox machines back then, so when he threw down the first set of tablets, what did they have to do? Well, God helped him out a bit, but it's not easy to write things on stone. So anyway. But that's the summary comments about Moses, and for us to learn from him both meekness and humility, the willingness to lead. We can all be leaders in our own way, in our own times, whether it's teaching one-on-one with others or in roles in the church, whatever it might be, there are times where God is going to want us to lead. And if we look back at Moses, we may see in ourselves sometimes a reticence or a reluctance to take that leadership role. When in fact, God says, no, I need you to lead right now. And we need to be aware of that, and it's something that I know for myself, I have to look and make sure I'm stepping up to the plate as God wants me to do, just as he asked Moses to do. So, summary thoughts, comments? Yeah, Michael.
I was just reminded yet again, I think this was mentioned in the first class, but as good as Moses was in so many ways, and as much, he points us to Christ, but he's just an example, right? I was just reminded of him being a shadow of what's to come, and he had his imperfections, but I'm just reminded of those passages that talk about the men in the Old Testament, or the figures in the Old Testament that way.
Yep. Okay, moving right along. If we were to take the Israelites as just one set of character traits, there's a lot we can learn from them, and examples both good and bad. Excuse me. So first question, how many of them were there, do you think, at this time? Ballpark. Excuse me. 625,000 males, right? You're pretty quick on that, Robert. Thank you. He just muted me while I had to cough. 625,000 males, that's a lot of people. Estimates are about 1.5 to 2 million total by the time you take women, children all together. There's some actual mathematical models that say if you take the birth rate that we see in the first generations after Jacob, and you take the comment that the Lord blessed the women in Israel and they were very prolific, and you take the time frame, you can come up with 4 million people. Now, I'm not saying that's the number, but from a population growth point of view, you could actually get to a very, very large number. But we're talking 1.5, 2 million, something like that, million people. Oh, I'm fine. Thank you very much. I'll take you up on it in about 10 minutes, though. It's a lot of people. And so God says, here you are, or Moses says, here you are today as the stars of heaven in multitude. There's a bunch. Okay, so it's a large crowd that's migrating from Egypt through Sinai and back up to Canaan. So what traits do we see about these people? What can we learn about these people today? We already heard from Mike, what was it, whining? They were rebellious. At times they did try to do good, didn't they? That's right, they're not focused. Yeah. Short-sighted, I like that one too. Overconfident? Right. We can take the land without the Lord, right? That didn't work so well.
They were weak.
They were weak? Yes. forgetful of what the Lord had done. I'm constantly amazed that they saw all these wonders, signs, the plagues on Egypt, what he did in the wilderness, and they can't remember that very long. It's hard to fathom, but that's what happened. The apostles did that too, didn't they?
After all they witnessed,
Right. Yeah. Like us, that's right. That's a good point. Mike? Oh, sounds like us? Okay. Okay, a couple of things. We've mentioned a lot of these. Complainers, they fell into idolatry quickly, which is also amazing to me. That we had the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, visible evidence of the God of creation with them. And what do? They fall into idolatry. It's amazing to me. Full of lusts. They had a hunger problem, right? They wanted leeks, lemons, whatever else, everything else back in Egypt. They wanted to go back to the way things were, and they weren't ever happy with what they had. So the idea of contentment was maybe a foreign concept to them in many ways. Always wanted to go back. They always doubted the Lord. Even though we always came through for them, they doubted the Lord a lot, and they were quick to turn away. And that was that short time frame that I could talk about. Brian?
Hypothesize why God changed Jacob's name to Israel, because I think Israel means rebellion or something along those lines.
What was that? Wrestling with God. Yeah. And so there was this constant tension, right, between the people and God. So the examples for us, we referred to this in our kickoff class back in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. All the things that Paul lists there, and so did some of them, so did some of them, so did some of them. And so they were kind of enumerated for us in the New Testament. And again, for our example and our admonition that we don't do the same thing. And then finally, if you were to look at the words of Jesus, and this is where this applies to us because I see it specifically in the Israelites, and sometimes we see it in us as well. Jesus said to him, "No one having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God." What were the Israelites constantly doing? Looking back to Egypt, wishing it was the way it was before. Ian?
I just wanted to, I'm just taking a moment here to look at these traits, and I think this is just really a self-reflection of all the things that I personally struggle with. I mean, how often do we complain about things? We find ourselves putting things in the world and making an idol of them. We lust for things that we don't have. We're longing, the grass is always greener, you know. We want to return to Egypt, to a better day. We're always looking back at better times and, you know, just doubting the Lord and what he will do for us and what he's promised us. You know, this is just staring me right in the face, like, this is you. You check all of these things. We are essentially Israel today still, and it's good to look back at this to have some self-reflection and see where we can improve.
Yeah, really good again. And again, that's why these were written for us, that we can learn from them. And Mike?
I always find it interesting and phenomenal that most of the time when we talk about the Israelites, it's how can they do this? How can they turn that quickly? Just on and on. It's like we're in awe that they are so on the edge that they can turn real quick, or they forget about this, or they want to go back. We're looking in a mirror. That's what we've got to realize, is that it's not, oh, look back at the Israelites and how, crazy they were or whatever. Folks, that's a mirror for us. And we've got to look, as Ian was saying, we've got to look in that mirror, because if we go by that list, every one of us can check off that list.
Absolutely. Yep. Fully agree. Brian?
I just want to say that we understand the first covenant.
The law of Moses brought death. It brought condemnation. And of course, under the new covenant, we have life. But the point I wanted to make here is that, again, going back to the Day of Atonement, even under the first covenant, God made provision for the sins of the people, that they could be forgiven and remain in that covenant relationship. It was the imperfect prophetic version of the perfect, but because of the sacrifice of Christ, which is reflected in the Day of Atonement, we now have a covenant relationship with God that we can count on.
Absolutely. Speaking of that, last character study is the Lord. So he's the other point of continuity through this entire series of chapters. What do we learn about the Lord in these 4 books? Yes.
So kind of building off one of the last points about the Israelites, and we see the comparisons with the Israelites' character and our own character today, and then you think about where would we be without the Lord today, without his continual sacrifice for us, and so often we take that for granted.
Absolutely. Others?
Guarding us. He's our manna.
He takes care of us, right?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, in all ways.
Faithful. He does what he says he will do.
Faithful promises, that's absolutely true, both positive and negative, right? Mhm. Right. We can go through a few of these really quick. First of all, he loved his people. And it says that specifically in Deuteronomy chapter 4. He loved them and wanted to care for them. He saved them from their enslavement, got them out of that, and brought them to a new land. He saved his people. Provided for them, just like Brian was saying. Shoes didn't wear out, clothes didn't wear out, they always had food. And he hates sin and disobedience. So this is another thing that we learn about God. His nature has not changed. He's the same as he has been since creation. And so we look back at the multiple times he threatened to just start over, and it didn't happen, thanks to Moses' willingness to intercede for his people. But he hates sin and disobedience. He's not going to tolerate it. And finally, he is full of love and mercy for those that obey him. So those traits go hand in hand. If we're faithful to God and we're obedient to him, his love and mercy abounds towards us. And it's the same thing we have in the New Testament through his son, Jesus. Gotten rid of all the things that were under the old law, and now we have the grace and mercy that God has extended to us through his son, but that is fully consistent with everything he did for Israel in these 4 books of the Old Testament. We'll skip this real quick. It will be online if you want to look this up, but I did put in some evidences of what took place in that time frame. There's a lot of talk about, well, we never see this documented in Egyptian history that this took place. Well, it doesn't have to be because it's documented in archaeology and other places. But if you were a big bad Pharaoh and you got into the afterlife by proving what good things you had done, do you want to write down things that went wrong? Probably not, okay? But that doesn't keep others from finding things that happened at that same time frame. So look at these things if you would, and just have a look at them. This is not meant to say they're scripture, but they are nice evidence packages that say, here's why we can have confidence in the Bible again. So we've got these, the mass exodus took place very quickly. We've got a writer that describes something that sounds a whole lot like the 10 plagues taking place in Egypt. We have got discoveries of Jericho that we know were destroyed in the same time frame. And last but not least, interestingly enough, the Egyptian king Atonement, I think I said that right, or maybe confusing that name with the Mummy. Remember that movie? Got you on that one, didn't I? Okay. Whatever that guy's name is, the military campaign stopped right about that time frame. Why would that be? They might have gotten wet. They might all be sitting at the bottom of the Red Sea. Okay, that might be the correlation we're looking for. Anyway, these are there in the online points, or the PowerPoints. Focus events, I think I'm going to save this, and we'll pick up Wednesday night. We'll start with this because we're going to hit this and the overview of the law. That's the other dimension that we'll look at for these 4 books, is how the law is laid out and some of the things we learn about. So we'll cover our focus events and the ties to Jesus, the first part of the class on Wednesday, and then get into the detailed discussion of the law. How much time do we have? Like 2 minutes? No minutes. Okay, let's stop right there. Good timing. Thanks so much. Sorry to pick on everyone on the front rows, but